What's up, guys? Welcome back to The Educated Barfly. Today, I am here with Nick. I'm in beautiful, sunny San Francisco today. We're in Nick's kitchen. He has been so gracious to invite us over and to do this awesome episode on whiskey and bourbon for you.
Yeah.
So thanks for having us, man.
Thanks for coming up here and kicking it with us in my kitchen. Happy to have you.
It's a nice kitchen. I'm happy to be here. Okay, so Nick and I were discussing a little bit before we started, decided to shoot this video. And we decided that doing all of the different whiskey styles was going to be a little bit clunky. So we decided that we would focus mainly on American whiskey and then specifically on bourbon, because that is what a lot of people have been asking me about on my channel. And I'm assuming people have been asking you, right?
For sure. And it's a huge category. We could do 60 minutes on it and we probably get a bunch of crap wrong and we get skewered in the comments as a result. So
which brings me to my next point. Neither one of us are experts. I know what I know, and I'm sharing what I know with you. If you guys want to contribute to things I don't know, do it respectfully and below in the comments. But we are not whiskey experts, but I have been bartending for many, many years, and I have picked up about a thing or two, and I do like to read. So I accredit a lot of my knowledge to David Wondrich and other wonderful spirits writers that I am forgetting to name now, but you are just as important. Okay, cool. So whiskey, American whiskey. How did we start distilling American whiskey? So basically, the first 13 colonies were created by immigrants from Europe largely, and most of those people were farmers. So what farmers would do to preserve their excess grains at the end of the season would be to distill them into a spirit. And whiskey production has been going on in Scotland for a lot longer than it has been going on in the United States and Ireland too, I would assume. So they brought their whiskey making tradition to the United States. The thing is that so when we started distilling stuff, we actually started distilling rum because we were basically getting molasses from the Caribbean. We knew that they were making rum, so we decided that we would learn how to make to make rum. And so we had a very big, in those first 13 colonies and Massachusetts specifically, there was a very big rum making tradition. But when we started to look around at native plants that we could use or native fruits that we could use, the first thing that we landed upon was apples. So we started making what was called Applejack, and I will not get into why it's called Applejack because that is not a video about Applejack. But after making Applejack, we also took a look around to see what grains would grow, and so in those first 13 colonies, which were in the northern part of the states, which is kind of a more harsh climate, we found out that rye would grow there very well. Rye is a hardy grain. It will grow in very extreme weather. So we took that and we started distilling that, and that brought us to rye production, which is the very first distilled American whiskey would be rye. I will say though that bourbon a law was enacted. It was Congress enacted a law that said that bourbon is now the native spirit of the United States in 1964. And I would think that's because it is like largely the most popular style of whiskey that we have here. The way that bourbon came about was that Alexander Hamilton and some of the first forefathers, I know George Washington was involved, wanted to levy taxes against spirits distillation to the tune of 6 cents per gallon. This was in 1791. Now I'm going to quote David Wondrich here in saying that there are like two types of Americans in America. There are those types of Americans that say if I follow all the rules and I go to church and I do my job really well, I am just going to find happiness that way. And then there are those Americans that said, I'm American and you can't tell me what the hell to do. I would think that the first whiskey producers, especially being of Irish and Scottish descent, were of the latter category, right? You think?
I would imagine.
So there was basically this event called the Whiskey Rebellion. It happened in 1791, where there was a standoff between the government and whiskey producers. The whiskey producers felt that the 6 cent a gallon tax levied against them was unfair to smaller producers, and they said, we're not going to pay that. And it got to a boiling point, to the point where the shots were fired, people were killed, and it looked like we were going to go into full-fledged revolution. This standoff lasted for about 3 years, but there are those people who decided that they did not want to fight, and they did not want to pay the tax, and they weren't going to do it. So what they did is they moved out of the area to make it impossible for the government tax collectors to come get them, and that frontier, I guess, was in Kentucky. So Kentucky is a warmer climate. It is favorable to growing corn, and so that was what the grain we were producing in Kentucky was at that time. And like I said, farmers that use their excess grain, fathers that don't use all of their grain, they take all that excess grain, they distill it to preserve it through the winter. And so they started making this kind of corn-based whiskey. Now I got this from my friend Adam Fournier, who is the beverage director, or it's one of the bar managers over at the Nomad Hotel in LA. He knows a lot about whiskey, and he was telling me that the most reputable idea, I guess, or the most reputable story behind why bourbon is called bourbon. That was very clunky, and it took me a lot to get to it there. But the most reputable story about why bourbon is called bourbon is because basically they were shipping barrels of bourbon down the Mississippi River to disseminate it to some of the southern states. And the people in Louisiana were really favorable to the whiskey coming down from Bourbon County, Kentucky. They were used to drinking moonshine from their neighbors. This was much superior whiskey. And so they would say, like, I really want to get that. I want to get that whiskey that's coming down from Bourbon County. I think that sounds, I can't say that that's true, but it sounds very sensible, isn't it?
Sounds about right. Yeah.
Cool. I think we actually hit all the points, like in the history of. So this is going to be a 2-part episode. I forgot to say this earlier. If you want to continue this lesson, we're going to take the next episode. We're going to take the next episode, part 2, over to cocktail chemistry, where we're going to talk about the designations of whiskey. We're going to do some whiskey tasting, hopefully, because we're going to a lot of whiskey here. It's just
we better be diving in. We've been talking a lot and not drinking, and so I'm getting a little anxious over here.
Right, me too. So. I'm getting a little like. All right, cool. So let's definitely go over to cocktail chemistry for part 2, and we'll talk about what makes bourbon bourbon, what makes rye rye, and why is something just called whiskey.
Yeah.